A Pair of Schoolgirls, written by Angela Brazil. Chapter 1. A School Election. It was precisely 5 minutes past 11 on the first day of the autumn term, and Avondale College, which for 7 whole weeks had been lonely and deserted and given over to the tender mercies of paper hangers, painters, and charwomen, once more presented its wonted aspect of life and bustle. The reopening was a very important event in the opinion of everybody concerned, partly because it marked the beginning of a fresh school year, and partly because the building had been altered and enlarged. Many changes made in the curriculum, and many new names added to the already long list in the register. 387 pupils had assembled that morning in the great lecture hall, the largest number on record at the college. 5 additional classes had been formed, and there were 6 extra mistresses. At the 11 o'clock interval, the place seemed swarming with girls. They thronged the staircase and passages, filled the pantry, blocked the dressing rooms, and overflowed into the playground and the gymnasium. Girls of all sorts and descriptions, from the 10-year-olds who had just come up rather solemn and overawed, from the preparatory to those elect and superior damsels of 17 who were studying for their matriculation. By the empty stove in the juniors' common room stood half a dozen betwixt and betweens, whose average age probably worked out at 14 1/4, though Mavie Morris was a giantess compared with little Ruth Harmon. The 6 heads were bent together in closest proximity, and the 6 tongues were particularly active, for after the long summer holidays there was such a vast amount to talk about that it seemed almost impossible to discuss all the interesting items of news with sufficient rapidity. The old call. "Looks no end," said Grace Russell. "It's so smart and spanky now, one hardly knows it. Pictures in the classrooms, flowers on the chimney pieces, a stained glass window in the lecture hall, busts on brackets all along the corridor wall, and the studio floor polished. Every single place has been done up from top to bottom." "I'd like it better if it didn't smell so abominably of new paint," objected Noel Kennedy. "When I opened the studio door, the varnish stuck to my fingers. However, the school certainly looks much nicer. Why, even the book cupboard has been repapered." "That's because you splashed ink on the wall last term. Don't you remember how fearfully cross Miss Hardy was about it?" "Rather. She insisted that I'd done it on purpose and couldn't and wouldn't believe it was an accident." "Well, thank goodness we've done with her. I'm glad teachers don't move up with their forms. I'm of the opposite opinion to Hamlet, and I'd rather face the evils that I don't know than those I do. Miss Pittman can't possibly be any worse, and she may chance to be better." "I say, it's rather a joke our being in the upper 4th now, isn't it?" remarked Ruth Harmon. "I'm glad we've all gone up together," said Dorothy Greenfield. "There's only Marjorie Polton left behind, and she won't be missed. We're exactly the same old set, with the addition of a few new girls." "Do you realize," said Mavie Morris, "that we're the top class in the lower school now, and that one of us will be chosen warden? There'll be an election this afternoon." "Why, so there will. What a frantic excitement. We shall all have to canvass in the dinner hour. I wonder if Miss Tempest has put up the list of candidates yet? I vote we go to the notice board and see. There's just time before the bell rings." Off scrambled the girls at once, pushing and jostling one another in their eagerness to get to the lecture hall. There was a crowd collected round the notice board, but they elbowed their way to the front notwithstanding. Yes, the list was there, in the headmistress's own handwriting, and they scanned it with varying comments of joy or disappointment, according as their names were present or absent. "Hurrah! Disgusting. No luck for me. I don't call it fair. You're on, Dorothy Greenfield, and so am I. I say, girls, which of you'll promise to vote for me?" Avondale College was a large day school. Its pupils were drawn from all parts of Colleminster and the surrounding district, many coming in by train or tramcar, and some on bicycles. Under the headmistressship of Miss Tempest, its numbers had increased so rapidly that extra accommodation had become necessary. And not only had the lecture hall and dressing rooms been enlarged, but an entire new wing had been added to the building. Avondale prided itself greatly upon its institutions. It is not always easy for a day school to have the same corporate life as a boarding school, but Miss Tempest, in spite of this difficulty, had managed to inaugurate a spirit of union among her pupils and to make them work together for the general good of the community. She wished the college to be not merely a place where textbooks were studied, but a central point of light on every possible subject. She encouraged the girls to have many interests outside the ordinary round of lessons, and by the help of various self-governing societies, to learn to be good citizens and to play an intelligent and active part in the progress of the world. A nature study union, a guild of arts and crafts, a debating club, a dramatic circle, and a school magazine all flourished at Avondale. The direction of these societies was in the hands of a select committee chosen from the 5th and 6th forms. But in order that the younger girls might be represented, a member of the upper 4th was elected each year as warden of the lower school and was privileged to attend some of the meetings and to speak on behalf of the interests of the juniors. Naturally, this post was an exceedingly coveted honor. The girl who held it became the delegate and mouthpiece of the lower forms, an acknowledged authority and the general leader of the rest. It was the custom to elect the warden by ballot on the afternoon of the reopening day. 6 candidates were selected by Miss Tempest, and these were voted for by the members of the several divisions of the 3rd and 4th form. Among the 6 chosen for this election, none was more excited about her possible chances than Dorothy Greenfield, and as our story centers round her and her doings, she merits a few words of description. She was a tall, slim, rather out of the common-looking girl, and though at present she was passing through the ugly duckling stage, she had several good points, which might develop into beauty later on. Her large dark gray eyes, with their straight, well-marked brows, made you forgive her nondescript nose. She lacked color, certainly, but her complexion was clear, and despite her rather thin cheeks, the outline of her face was decidedly pleasing. Her mouth was neat and firm, and her chin square, and she had a quantity of wavy, fluffy brown hair that had an obstreperous way of escaping from its ribbon and hanging over her ears. During the past 6 months, Dorothy had shot up like Jack's beanstalk, and she was still growing fast, an awkward process which involved a certain angularity of both body and mind. She was apt to do things by fits and starts. She formed hot attachments or took violent prejudices. She was amiable or irritable according to her mood, and though capable of making herself most attractive, could flash out with a sharp retort if anybody offended her. She had a favorable report in the school. She was generally among those marked excellent in her form, and she was above the average at hockey and tennis, had played a piano solo at the annual concert, won highly commended at the arts and crafts exhibition, and contributed an article to the school magazine, possessing such a good all-round record. Therefore, Dorothy might have as reasonable a possibility of success as anybody else at the coming election, and she could not help letting her hopes run high. The ballot was to be taken at 3:30, which left little time for canvassing. But she meant to do the best for herself that circumstances would allow. She was a day boarder, so when morning classes were over, she strolled into the juniors' common room to discuss her chances. Already some papers were pinned up claiming attention for the various candidates. Vote for Val Barnett, the hockey champion. Hope Lawson begs all her friends to support her in the coming election. Grace Russell solicits the favor of your votes. Noel Kennedy relies upon the kindness of the lower school. Hello, Dorothy, said Mavie Morris. Aren't you going to add your quota to the general lot? All the others are getting up their appeals. I wish Miss Tempest had put me on the list of likelies. I can't think why she didn't, replied Dorothy. I should say you're far more suitable than Noel Kennedy. Why, so do I naturally. But there, it can't be helped. I'm not among the elect, so I must just grin and bear it. Is this your appeal? Let me look. He seized the piece of paper from Dorothy's hand and, scanning it eagerly, read the following lines. You voters at the school election? I beg you'll look in my direction. I hate to boast and brag, but yet, for once I'm blowing my own trumpet. Now don't you think in me you'd find a candidate suited to your mind? No bookworm I, but fond of sports, hockey or games of other sorts. At acting I can run the show and play my part as well you know. And at meetings all your wants, I'd state, and make a speech at the debate. I'd back in all scholastic storms the interests of the lower forms. A zealous leader I should be. So when you vote, please remember me. I hope these verses you will pardon, and choose me for the lower school warden." "What do you think of it?" asked Dorothy. "I made it up during the history lesson and wrote it on my knee under the desk. One wants something rather different from other people's, and I thought perhaps no one else would have a rhyming address." "It's not bad," commented Mavie, "but you do brag." "I've apologized for it. One must state one's qualifications, or what's the use of being a candidate? Look at Val's notice. She calls herself the hockey champion. No one takes Val too seriously. I don't believe she's the ghost of a chance, though she did win the cup last season. One needs more than that for a warden. Brains count as well as muscles." "I know. That's why I tried poetry." "Please don't call that stuff poetry. Half of the lines won't scan." There was a pucker between Dorothy's dark eyebrows as she snatched back her literary bantling. "I don't suppose that matters. Everybody isn't so viper-critical," she retorted. "Shall I pin it up here or in the gym?" "It will be more seen here. But I warn you, Dorothy, I don't think the girls will like it." "Why not?" "Well, it's clever enough, but it's cheeky. I'm afraid somehow it won't catch on. If you take my advice, you'll tear it up and just write a vote for Dorothy Greenfield instead." But taking other people's advice was not at present included in Dorothy's scheme of existence. She much preferred her own ideas, however crude. "I'll leave it as it is," she answered loftily. "It can't fail to attract attention anyhow." "As you like. By the by, if you're going round canvassing, there's been a new—" But Dorothy did not wait to listen. She was annoyed at Mavie's scant appreciation of her poetic effort, and having manifested her independence by pinning the offending verses on the notice board, she stalked away, trying to look nonchalant. She was determined to use every means at hand to ensure success, and her best plan seemed to be to go round personally soliciting votes. "I'll tackle the dinner girls now," she thought, "and I expect there'll be just time to catch the others when they come back in the afternoon. Thank goodness the election is only among the 3rd and 4th. It would be terrible if one had to go all round the school. Why, I never asked Mavie. How stupid! But she's certain to be on my side. She detests Val, and she's not particularly fond of Hope either, though of course there's Grace. Had I better go back and make sure of her?" On the whole, she decided that as she had left Mavie, in rather a high and mighty manner, it would seem a little beneath her dignity to return at once and beg a favor, so she went into the playground instead to beat up possible electors. She was not the first in the field, by any means. Already Valentine Barnett and her satellites were hard at work coaxing and wheedling, while the emissaries of Doris Earnshaw and Noel Kennedy were urging the qualifications of their particular favorites. Hope Lawson was seated on the seesaw, in company with a number of small girls from the lower seconds. "What's she doing that for?" thought Dorothy. "Those kids haven't got votes. It's sheer waste of time to bother with them. She's actually put her arm round that odious little Maggie Moore and taken Nell Boughton on her knee. I shouldn't care to make myself so cheap. I suppose she's letting Blanche Hall and Irene Jackson do her canvassing for her." Dorothy was, however, too much occupied with her own affairs to concern herself greatly about her neighbors' movements. To put her claims adequately before each separate elector was no mean task, and time fled all too quickly. She used what powers of persuasion she possessed and flattered herself that she had made an impression in some quarters. But very few of the girls would give any definite promises. Many of them, especially those of the middle and lower thirds, seemed to enjoy the importance of owning something which it was in their power to withhold. "I'm waiting till I've heard what you all 6 have to say for yourselves," said Kitty Palgrave condescendingly. "I shan't make up my mind until the very last minute." "It's so difficult to choose between you," added Ellie Simpson, a pert little person of 12. Their tone verged on the offensive, and in any other circumstances Dorothy would have administered a snub. As it was, she pocketed her pride and merely said she hoped they would remember her. She heard them snigger as she turned away and longed to go back and shake them, but discretion prevailed. One has to put up with this sort of thing if one wants to get returned warden, she reflected. All the same, it's sickening to be obliged to truckle to young idiots like that. She had not by any means found all the possible voters, so she decided to return to the juniors' common room. Mavie had gone, but a number of other girls stood near the notice board talking and reading the appeals of the various candidates. Dorothy strolled up to see how her verses were being received. They made a different impression on different minds, to judge from the comments that met her ears. "It's ripping," exclaimed Bertha Warren. "Does she can run the show, does she?" sneered Joyce Hickson. "I call it just lovely," gushed Addie Parker. "Her trumpeter's dead, certainly," giggled Phyllis Fowler. "Hello, Dorothy. I didn't see you were there." "I'm going to vote for you, Dorothy," said Bertha, "and so is Addie. Phyllis has promised hope, and Joyce is on Val's side. If you like, I'll canvass for you here while you do the gym. You better not waste any time because the others are hard at it, and it's best to get first innings if you can." Dorothy hastily agreed and hurried off to the gymnasium, where she was fortunate enough to catch some of her own classmates. They were all sucking enormous peppermint humbugs and were almost speechless in consequence. But they had the politeness to listen to her, which was more than she had experienced from some of the girls. "Very sorry," replied Annie Gray, talking with difficulty. "You should have asked us sooner. Val's been round and simply coerced us. She made it a hockey versus lacrosse contest. And of course we plumped for hockey," murmured Elsie Bellamy. "Val's simply ripping at hockey." "Is that all you care for?" exclaimed Dorothy scornfully. "Val has nothing else to recommend her." "Hasn't she? What about peppermint humbugs?" "I call them a very substantial recommendation." "Did Val give you those?" "Rather, she put on her hat and bolted out into High Street and bought a whole pound. Lucky Miss James didn't catch her as she dodged back." "She's handing them round to everybody," added Helen Walker. "I wish I had taken two." For once Dorothy's pale cheeks put on a color. She could not restrain her indignation. How atrociously and abominably mean. She burst out. "Why, it's just bribery, pure and simple. I didn't think Val was capable of such a sneaking trick. She knows quite well how unfair it is to the rest of us." "Why, you could have done the same if you'd liked," laughed Elsie. "It's not too late now. I've a preference for caramels if you ask me." "I'd be ashamed," declared Dorothy. "Surely you ought to give your votes on better grounds than humbugs or caramels. Such a thing has never been done before at the Call." "All the more loss for us," giggled Helen flippantly. "Do you mean to tell me you don't care whether a candidate behaves dishonorably or not?" "Not I, if she's jolly." "I'm disgusted with you, absolutely disgusted. If you haven't a higher ideal of what's required in a warden, you don't deserve to have votes at all." "Draw it mild, Dorothy," chirped Elsie. "I'll tell you what I think of you. You're a set of greedy things. There isn't one of you with a spark of public spirit, and if the election is going to be run on these lines, But Dorothy's tirade was interrupted by the dinner bell, and the objects of her scorn, hastily swallowing the offending peppermints, decamped at a run, leaving her to address a group of empty chairs. She followed more leisurely, fuming as she went. She knew she had been foolish and most undiplomatic to lose her temper so utterly, but the words had rushed out before she could stop them. "They wouldn't have voted for me in any case," she said to herself, "so it really doesn't matter after all. They're only a minority. I expect it will prove a very even affair, perhaps a draw, and that no one will have a complete walkover." Chapter 2. What Dorothy Overheard. At 3:30, exactly in the middle of the French reading lesson, Miss James, the school secretary, entered the upper fourth room with a sheaf of voting papers in her hand. These were dealt round to all the girls, with the exception of the candidates, and Miss James gave a brief explanation of what was required. On each paper you will find 6 names. You must put a cross to the one you wish to choose for your warden. Do not write anything at all, but fold the paper and hand it in to Miss Pittman, who will place it in this box, which I shall call for in 5 minutes. So saying, she bustled away in a great hurry to perform a similar errand in the next classroom. The 6 candidates tried to sit looking disinterested and unconscious while their fates were being decided. Hope Lawson hunted out words in the dictionary. Valentine Barnett made a parade of arranging the contents of her pencil box, and the others opened books and began preparation. Not a word was allowed to be spoken. In dead silence, the girls recorded their crosses and handed in their papers, and the last was hardly dropped into the ballot box before Miss James reappeared. The result of the election was to be announced at 4 o'clock. Therefore, there were still 20 minutes of suspense. Miss Pittman went on with the French reading as if nothing had happened, and Dorothy made a gallant effort to fix her attention on Le Jeune Patriot and to forget that Miss Tempest and Miss James were hard at work in the library counting votes. Nobody's translation was particularly brilliant that afternoon. Everyone was watching the clock and longing for the end of the lesson. When the bell rang, there was a general scuffle. Books were seized and desk lids banged, and though Miss Pittman called the form to order and insisted upon a decorous exit from the room, the girls simply pelted down the stairs to the lecture hall. In a few moments, the whole school had assembled. There was not long to wait, for exactly at the stroke of 4, Miss Tempest walked onto the platform and made the brief announcement. Hope Lawson has been elected warden of the lower school by a majority of 50 votes. Dorothy left the lecture hall with her head in a whirl. That Hope should have won by such an enormous majority was most astonishing. She could not understand it. Conversation was strictly forbidden on the staircase, but the moment she reached the gymnasium door, she burst into eager inquiries. "Yes, it's a surprise to everybody," said Ruth Harmon. "I thought myself that Val would get it. All the lower fourth and most of the upper third were for her." "Then how could Hope possibly score by 50? "She did it with the kids, I suppose." "But the first and second weren't voting?" "Indeed they were." "Do you mean to say you never knew? Why, Miss James gave it out this morning." "Of all cells," gasped Dorothy, "I heard nothing about it. It's the first year those kids have ever taken part in the election. Why couldn't some of you tell me?" "I was just going to," said Mavie. "But you stalked away and wouldn't listen. It's your own fault, Dorothy. You might have run after me." "You looked so lofty. I didn't feel disposed." "Val didn't know either," interposed Bertha Warren. "She never canvassed in the first or the second. No more did Grace or Noé. I'm not certain if any of you knew except Hope. Only a few were in the room when Miss James gave it out." "Then she's taken a most mean advantage," said Dorothy. "I understand now why she was sitting on the seesaw making herself so extremely pleasant. It's not fair. Miss James ought to have announced to the whole school that such a change had been made." "Oh, and tell her so," sneered Phyllis Fowler. "Those who lose always call things unfair," added Joyce Hickson. Dorothy walked away without another word. She did not wish to be considered jealous, and her common sense told her that she had already said more than enough. She was too proud to ask for sympathy, and felt that her most dignified course was to accept her defeat in silence. She thought she would rather not speak even to her friends, so ignoring violent signals from Bertha Warren and Addie Parker, she went at once to put on her outdoor clothes. The dressing room, to provide greater accommodation, had not only hooks round the walls, but double rows of hat stands down the middle, with lockers for boots underneath. As Dorothy sat changing her shoes, she could hear 3 girls talking on the other side of the hat stand, though owing to the number of coats which were hanging up, the speakers were hidden from her. She recognized their voices, however, perfectly well. "I'm rather surprised at Hope getting it," Helen Walker was saying. "I thought Val was pretty safe. I voted for her, of course." "A good many voted for Dorothy," replied Evie Fenwick. "I know. I thought she might have had a chance even against Val. She'll be dreadfully disgusting." "I'm very glad Hope was chosen," said Agnes Lowe. "After all, she's far the most suitable for warden. She's ever so much cleverer than Val." "But not more than Dorothy." "No, but she's a girl of better position, and that counts for something. Her father was mayor last year, and her mother is quite an authority on education and speaks at meetings. Well, Dorothy's aunt writes articles for magazines. One often sees the name Barbara Sherborne in the newspapers. Dorothy's tremendously proud of her." "Dorothy needn't take any credit to herself on that account," returned Agnes, "for, as it happens, Miss Sherborne isn't her aunt at all. She's no relation." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I know for a fact that Dorothy is nothing but a waif, a nobody, who is being brought up for charity. Miss Sherborne adopted her when she was a baby." At this most astounding piece of information, Dorothy, who had followed the conversation without any thought of eavesdropping, flung her slippers into her locker and stalked round to the other side of the hat stand. "Agnes Lowe, what do you mean by telling such an absolute story?" she asked grimly. "I'd no idea you were there," returned Agnes. "Listeners never hear any good of themselves," laughed Helen. I'm extremely glad I overheard. It gives me a chance to deny such rubbish. I shall expect Agnes to make an instant apology." Dorothy's tone was aggressive. She waited with a glare in her eyes and a determined look about her mouth. Agnes did not flinch, however. "I'm sorry you heard what I said, Dorothy," she replied. "It wasn't meant for you, but it's true all the same, and I can't take back my words." "How can it be true?" Agnes put on her hat hastily and seized her satchel. "You'd better ask Miss Sherborne. Probably everyone in Hereford knows about it except yourself. Come, Helen, I'm ready now," and she hurried away with her two friends, evidently anxious to escape further questioning. Dorothy took up her pile of home lesson books and followed them, but they must have raced down the passage, for when she reached the door, they were already disappearing round the corner of the playground. It was useless to think of pursuing them. She had barely time, as it was, to catch her train, and she must walk fast if she meant to be at the station by 4:30. She scurried along High Street, keeping a watchful eye on the town hall clock, in the intervals of dodging passengers on the pavements and dashing recklessly over crossings. At Station Road, she quickened her footsteps to a run and tore up the flight of stairs. That was the shortest cut to the ticket office. Fortunately, she possessed a contract, so she had no further delay and was able to scuttle across the platform into the Hereford train. The guard, who knew her well by sight, smiled as he slammed the door of her compartment. "A near shave today, missy. I see you're back at school," he remarked, then waved his green flag. Dorothy sank down breathlessly. To miss the 4:30 would have meant waiting 3/4 of an hour, a tiresome experience which she had gone through before and had no desire to repeat. She was lucky, certainly. But now that the anxiety of catching the train was over, the reaction came and she felt both tired and cross. What an enormously long time it seemed since she had started that morning, and what a horrid day it had been. She leaned back in a corner of the compartment and took a mental review of everything that had happened at school. Her expectation of winning the election, her canvassing among the girls, their many ill-natured remarks, Val's method of bribery, and Hope's unfair advantage. She was bitterly chagrined at missing the wardenship, and the thought that she might have had a chance of success if she had known of the voting powers of the first and second forms only added to her disappointment. She was indignant and out of temper with Mavie, with Hope, with the whole of her little world. Everything had seemed to go wrong, and to crown all, Agnes Lowe had dared to call her a nobody and a charity child. What could Agnes mean? It was surely a ridiculously false accusation, made from spite or sheer love of teasing. She, Dorothy Greenfield, a waif. The idea was impossible. Why, she had always prided herself upon her good birth. The Sherbornes were of knightly race, and their doings were mentioned in the county history of Devonshire as far back as Queen Elizabeth's reign. Of course, her name was Greenfield, not Sherborne, but she was of the same lineage, and she had pasted the family crest inside her schoolbooks. She would trace out her pedigree that very evening right to Sir Thomas Sherborne, who helped to fit out a ship to fight the Armada, and she would take a copy to school tomorrow and show it to Agnes, who could not fail to be convinced by such positive evidence. Yes, the girls should see that. Far from being a nobody, she was really of a better family than Hope Lawson, whose claims to position rested solely on her father's public services to the city of Colminster. And yet, under all her assurance there lurked an uneasy sensation of doubt. She had taken it for granted that her mother was a Sherborne, but she remembered now that when she had spoken of her as such, Aunt Barbara had always evaded the subject. Nobody ever mentioned her parents. She had thought it was because they were dead. But surely that was not a sufficient reason for the omission. Could there be another and a stronger motive for thus withholding all knowledge about them? Several things occurred to her. Hints that had been dropped by Martha, the maid, which, though not comprehended, had remained in her memory. Looks, glances, half-spoken sentences let fall by Aunt Barbara's friends. 100 nothings too small in themselves to be noticed, but, counted in the aggregate, quite sufficient to strengthen the unwelcome suspicion that had suddenly awakened. Rubbish, thought Dorothy, with an effort to dispel the black shadow. I'll ask Aunt Barbara, and I've no doubt she'll easily explain it all and set everything right. By this time the train had passed Ash Hill, Burnley, and Latchworth, and had arrived at Hereford, Dorothy's station. She stepped out of the compartment, so preoccupied with her reflections that she would have forgotten her books if a fellow passenger had not handed them. She scarcely noticed the rector and his children, who were standing on the platform, and turning a deaf ear to the youngest boy, who called to her to wait for them, she hurried off alone along the road. It was a pleasant walk to her home, between green hedges and with a view of woods and distant hills. Hereford was quite a country place, and could boast of thatched cottages, a market cross, and a pair of stocks, although it lay barely 12 miles from the great manufacturing city of Colminster. Dorothy's destination was a little quaint, old-fashioned stone house that stood close by the roadside at the beginning of the village street. A thick, well-clipped holly hedge protected from prying eyes a garden where summer flowers were still blooming profusely. A strip of lawn was laid out for croquet, and a small orchard at the back held a moderate crop of pears and apples. Dorothy ran in through the creeper-covered porch, slammed her books on the hall table, then, descending 2 steps, entered the low-ceiled, oak-paneled dining room and rushed to fling her arms around a lady who was sitting doing fancy work near the open window. "Here I am at last, Annie. Oh, I feel as if I hadn't seen you for 100 years. I'm in the upper 4th, but it's been a hateful day. I never thought school was so horrid before. I'm very disappointed and disgusted and abominably cross." "Poor little woman. What's the matter?" said Aunt Barbara, taking Dorothy's face in her hands as the girl knelt by her side and trying to kiss away the frown that rested there. "You certainly don't look as if you had been enjoying yourself." "Enjoying myself? I should think not. We had an election for the wardenship, and my name was on the list, and I might perhaps have won if the others hadn't been so mean. But I didn't, and Hope Lawson has got it. We can't always win, can we? Never mind. It's something that your name was on the list of candidates. All the girls who lost will be feeling equally disappointed. Suppose you just forget about it. Go and take off your things, and tell Martha to make some buttered toast." Dorothy laughed. Already her face had lost its injured and woeful expression. "That's as good as saying, 'You don't make a fuss about nothing.' All right, Annie, I'm going. But I warn you that this is only a respite, and I mean to give you a full and detailed list of all my particular grievances after tea. So make up your mind to it, and brace your dear nerves." Miss Barbara Sherborne was a most charming personality. She was young enough to be still very pretty and attractive, but old enough to take broad views of life and to have attained that independence of action which is the prerogative of middle age. She was a clever and essentially a cultured woman. She had lived abroad in her youth, and the glamour of old Italian cities and soft, southern skies still seemed to cling to her. She was a good amateur musician, could sketch a little, and had lately obtained some success in writing. Ever since Dorothy could remember, she and Aunt Barbara and Martha, the maid, had lived together at Holly Cottage, a particularly harmonious trio, liking their own mode of life and quite independent of the outside world. The little house seemed to fit its inmates and, in spite of its small accommodation, to provide just what was wanted for each. First, there was the old-fashioned dining room, with its carved oak furniture, blue china, and rows of shining pewter, its choice prints on the walls, its bookshelves overflowing with interesting volumes, and the desk where Aunt Barbara wrote in the mornings, a room that seemed made especially for comfort and reached its acme of cossiness on a cold winter's day when armchairs were drawn up to the blazing fire that burnt in the quaint dog grate. Then there was the little drawing room with its piano and music rack and its great Japanese cabinet full of all kinds of treasures from foreign places. When Dorothy was a tiny girl, it had been her Sunday afternoon treat to be allowed to investigate the mysteries of this cabinet, to open its numerous drawers and sliding panels, and to turn over the miscellaneous collection of things it contained, and she still regarded it in the light of an old friend. The artistic decorations, the chintz hangings, the watercolor paintings of Italian scenes, all helped to give an aesthetic effect to the room, and to make a very pleasant whole. The kitchen was, of course, Martha's particular domain, but even here there were books and pictures, and a table reserved for writing desk and work basket. I fear Martha did not often busy herself with pens and paper, for she held head learning in good-natured contempt. But she appreciated her mistress's effort to make her comfortable and polished the brass-top inkpot diligently, if she seldom used it. Peterkin, the gray Persian cat, generally sat in the armchair or on Martha's knee, which he much preferred when he got the chance. And Draco, the green parrot, hobbled up and down his perch at the sunny window, repeating his stock of phrases, begging for titbits, or imitating smacking kisses. Just at the top of the stairs was Dorothy's special sanctum. It had formerly been her nursery and still contained her old doll's house, put away in a corner, though her toys were now replaced by schoolgirl possessions. Here she kept her tennis racket, her hockey stick, her camera and photographic materials, her collections of stamps, crests, and picture postcards. There was a table where she could use paste or glue or indulge in various sticky performances forbidden in the dining room, and a cupboard where oddments could be stored without the painful necessity of continually keeping them tidily arranged. She could try experiments in sweet making, clay modeling, bookbinding, or any of the other arts and crafts that were represented at the annual school exhibition. In fact, it was a dear, delightful den where she could conduct operations without being obliged to move her things away and might make a mess in defiance of Martha's chidings. Dorothy often took a peep into her sanctum on her return from Avondale, but today she ran straight to her bedroom. She was anxious to finish tea and have a talk with Aunt Barbara. She felt she could not rest until she had mentioned Agnes Lowe's remarks and either proved or disproved their truth. It was not a question that she could raise. However, when Martha was coming into and going out of the dining room with hot water and toast, and it was only after she had cajoled Miss Sherborne to the privacy of the summer house and had related her other school woes that the girl ventured to broach the subject. "I know it's nonsense, Annie, but I thought I'd like to tell you all the same," she concluded, and waited for a denial with a look of anxiety in her eyes that belied her words. Miss Sherborne did not at once reply. Apparently, she was considering what answer to make. "I knew you would ask me this someday, Dorothy," she said at last. "It seemed unnecessary for you to know before, but you are growing older so fast that it is time you learnt your own story." Dorothy turned her face sharply away. She did not want even Aunt Barbara to see how her mouth was quivering. "Is it true, then?" she asked in a strangled voice. "Yes, dear child. In a sense, it is all absolutely true. The moral of chapters 1 and 2 of A Pair of Schoolgirls is that kindness, inclusion, and friendship help overcome challenges and build meaningful connections. Can't wait to dive into the next chapters. Stay tuned for more drama, fun, and schoolgirl adventures.